Ask most teams to try something new, and the resistance rarely comes from laziness. It comes from math, just not the kind anyone says out loud. There's a concept from psychology that explains this better than almost anything else in the management literature, and most managers have never heard its name, even though they deal with its effects every single week. It's called loss aversion, and once you understand it, you start seeing it behind almost every stalled rollout, every quietly ignored memo, every "we tried that before and it didn't work" objection that shows up the moment you propose something new. The idea comes from psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, whose research in the late 1970s reshaped how economists and psychologists think about decision-making under uncertainty. Their work eventually earned Kahneman a Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002, awarded for integrating psychological insight into economic science. One of their most influential findings was simple to state and strange to accept. Losses tend to feel more painful than equivalent gains feel good. Not slightly more painful, substantially more painful. Estimates commonly cited put the ratio somewhere around 1.5 to 2 times as painful, though later research has pushed back on the idea that there's any single universal ratio that applies across every context, every person, and every kind of loss. The exact number matters less than the direction of the effect, which shows up again and again. Losing $100 hurts more than gaining $100 feels rewarding, even though the two numbers are mathematically identical. A rational actor, the kind economists used to assume existed, should feel the same magnitude of emotion either way. Real people do not. The pain of the loss simply outweighs the pleasure of the equivalent gain, and that asymmetry is baked into how humans process risk. Once you sit with that asymmetry for a moment, it stops being a curious psychology fact and starts being a management tool, because it explains an enormous amount of workplace behavior that otherwise looks irrational. A new process that might improve output by 20%, but risks temporarily disrupting a system employees already trust, often gets resisted. Not because people dislike improvement, not because they're stubborn, or lazy, or resistant to progress on principle. They resist because the possible loss looms larger in their mind than the possible gain, even when the gain is objectively bigger on paper. 20% improvement sounds like a clear win to a manager looking at a spreadsheet. To the person who has to give up a familiar workflow to get there, it doesn't register as a 20% win. It registers as an uncertain, possibly painful disruption to something that currently works fine, in exchange for a promise that might or might not pay off. This is where the idea of psychological ownership becomes important, and it's worth spending real time on because it explains why loss aversion hits so hard, specifically in the workplace. Familiar tools, familiar routines, and familiar responsibilities all carry a kind of ownership that has nothing to do with legal or financial ownership. Nobody owns the spreadsheet template they've used for 3 years, or the exact sequence of steps they follow to close out a client file, or the specific way their team divides up weekly responsibilities. But psychologically, it can feel exactly like ownership. People built competence around these things. They know the edge cases. They know which shortcuts are safe and which ones bite you later. That accumulated familiarity is a kind of invisible asset, and any change threatens to take it away, even if what's being offered in return is objectively better on every measurable dimension. This overlaps with a closely related concept called the endowment effect, most associated with economist Richard Thaler's work in behavioral economics. The endowment effect describes how people assign more value to something simply because they already possess it, compared to how they'd value the exact same thing if they didn't yet own it. In classic demonstrations, people who were given a mug and then asked what price they'd sell it for demanded significantly more money than people who didn't have the mug were willing to pay for it, even though it was the identical object. Translate that into a workplace setting, and you get a manager who is baffled that employees aren't excited about a better system, without realizing that employees aren't evaluating the new system against some neutral baseline. They're evaluating it against something they already feel they own, and giving that up costs more, psychologically, than the new thing is worth gaining. This explains why announcements framed around what employees will lose, fewer responsibilities, less autonomy, an unfamiliar tool, trigger far stronger pushback than announcements framed around what they'll gain, even when both announcements describe the exact same underlying change. Framing matters enormously here. And it isn't just a communications nicety. It's the difference between a rollout that goes smoothly and one that turns into a months-long morale problem. The same policy shift, described as "you'll keep 90% of your current process" versus "you'll lose 10% of your current process," produces measurably different acceptance rates in studies of framing. Effects: despite being mathematically identical statements about the exact same change, 90% kept sounds like continuity. 10% lost sounds like an attack on something people worked hard to build. The information content is the same. The emotional content is not. Imagine, for a moment, a mid-sized team facing a system migration. Leadership announces that the team will be moving to a new project management tool that's faster, more integrated, and, by every objective metric leadership cares about, simply better than the old one. On paper, this should be an easy sell. In practice, the announcement lands badly, and not because the tool is bad. It lands badly because the announcement focuses entirely on what's new and says almost nothing about what stays the same. Employees don't hear "you're getting a faster tool." They hear "everything you've learned over the past 2 years is about to become irrelevant, and you're going to look incompetent while you relearn your own job." Nobody said that out loud. Nobody needed to. The silence around continuity did the damage all by itself, because loss aversion doesn't wait for confirmation. It fills in the worst-case scenario the moment ambiguity shows up, and once that worst-case story takes hold, no amount of enthusiasm from leadership can talk it back down easily. But here's the part nobody expects, and it's the part that separates managers who understand this from managers who just feel frustrated by irrational resistance. The resistance isn't a bug in your team. It's a completely predictable, well-documented feature of how human beings process risk, and it responds to a lever most managers never touch, which is the framing of the message itself, independent of the substance of the change. You don't need to change what you're proposing. You need to change what you say first. Lead with what stays the same. Say it clearly, specifically, and early, before you say anything about what's changing. Silence about stability isn't neutral. It's an invitation for people's imagination to fill that gap with worst-case loss. And worst-case loss is exactly what people resist hardest, harder than almost any realistic best-case gain can compensate for. It's worth distinguishing loss aversion from a couple of related concepts, because managers often blur them together, and the distinctions matter for what you actually do about each one. Status quo bias describes a general preference for things staying as they are, independent of any specific loss calculation. It's closely related to loss aversion, but slightly broader. Someone can prefer the status quo simply because change requires effort and attention, not because they've specifically calculated a loss. Loss aversion is more precise. It's about the asymmetric emotional weight of losses versus gains. Specifically, in practice, the two often show up together and reinforce each other. The status quo feels comfortable partly because it's familiar, and any deviation from it gets evaluated through a lens where losses are weighted more heavily than gains, which makes the status quo look even more attractive by comparison than it would under neutral evaluation. Sunk cost fallacy is a different animal entirely, though it's commonly confused with loss aversion because both involve a reluctance to let go of something. Sunk cost fallacy is about continuing to invest in something because of resources already spent. Time, money, effort, even when those resources are gone regardless of what you do next, and shouldn't factor into a forward-looking decision. Loss aversion is about the anticipated pain of a future loss, not the resources already sunk into the past. A manager who keeps funding a failing project because we've already put a year into it is exhibiting sunk cost fallacy. A team that resists adopting a clearly better tool because giving it up feels like losing something valuable is exhibiting loss aversion. They can compound each other in real workplace situations, but they're driven by different psychological mechanics, and a manager trying to solve one with a tactic meant for the other will usually get nowhere. Consider a second illustrative scenario. A department going through a restructuring where some employees are moved into new roles with different reporting lines. Objectively, several of these moves might genuinely be promotions, more visibility, more strategic scope, access to bigger projects. And yet the emotional reaction in the room often skews negative before anyone has even evaluated the actual content of the new role. Why? Because the announcement of a restructuring immediately activates loss-oriented thinking. People start scanning for what they're about to lose: their current manager, their current team, their current sense of where they stand, before they've had a chance to properly evaluate what they might gain. If leadership front-loads the message with what's ending, rather than what continues and what's added, the loss framing sets the emotional tone for the entire announcement, and everything that follows gets filtered through that initial frame, however positive the actual substance turns out to be. One more illustrative scenario worth walking through, because it shows how loss aversion shows up even when the loss is almost entirely symbolic. Imagine a manager who decides to flatten a team's hierarchy slightly, removing one layer of approval that used to sit between individual contributors and final decisions. The stated goal is speed, fewer steps, faster execution, less waiting around for sign-off. Objectively, most people on the team should welcome this. Fewer bottlenecks generally means less frustration day to day. And yet the people who used to sit in that approval layer, even if their title and pay don't change at all, often react as though something real has been taken from them. In a strict sense, nothing measurable has changed for them financially. But a piece of perceived authority, a checkpoint where their judgment mattered, is gone. And that loss registers emotionally, even though it never appeared on an org chart as a formal responsibility. This is loss aversion operating on status and perceived authority rather than on anything tangible. And it's exactly the kind of change where a manager who only thinks in terms of concrete, measurable losses will be caught completely off guard by resistance that, on paper, shouldn't exist at all. There's a practical lesson buried in all of this that goes beyond "be positive when you announce change," which is far too generic and doesn't actually tell a manager what to do differently on a Tuesday morning. The real, actionable lesson is to conduct what amounts to a framing audit before any change announcement goes out. Sit down with the actual message you're planning to send and ask, specifically, what percentage of this message is about what's ending versus what's continuing. If the message is 90% about the new system and 10% or less about what employees keep, you have a framing problem regardless of how good the underlying change actually is. Flip the ratio. Open with a clear, specific list of what stays exactly the same, not a vague reassurance like, "Don't worry, most things won't change," which reads as evasive rather than concrete, but an actual itemized list. Your reporting line stays the same. Your core client relationships stay the same. Your title stays the same. Then, and only then, introduce what's changing, framed as an addition or an upgrade rather than a subtraction. A second practical technique is to make the keep list as concrete and specific as the change list. Vague reassurance triggers suspicion because vague statements are exactly what people expect to hear right before bad news, and most employees have enough workplace experience to recognize that pattern instantly. Specificity is what makes reassurance credible. Naming the exact 3 things that won't change does more to calm a room than any amount of enthusiastic language about the exciting new direction the team is heading in. A third technique, particularly useful for larger changes, is phased rollout paired with visible reversibility, where genuinely possible, loss aversion is partly driven by the fear of an irreversible mistake, a loss you can't undo. When a change is explicitly framed as a trial period with a defined checkpoint, "We'll run this for 6 weeks and then reassess as a team," the psychological stakes drop substantially because the change no longer feels like a permanent loss of the old way. It feels like a reversible experiment, and reversible experiments trigger far less resistance than permanent feeling mandates, even when the actual content of the change is identical in both framings. A fourth technique is involving employees, in defining what counts as a loss before you announce anything, rather than guessing on their behalf. Managers often assume they know what employees value about the current system, and they're frequently wrong, focusing their reassurance on the wrong details entirely. A quick round of informal conversations before a formal announcement, asking people directly what they'd be most reluctant to give up about the current process, tells you exactly what needs to be protected or explicitly preserved in your messaging, rather than leaving you to guess and accidentally reassuring people about things they never worried about in the first place. while staying silent about the one thing they actually cared about losing. Here's the piece I think most management advice on change gets backwards. It treats resistance to change as a morale problem to be managed with enthusiasm and better selling. It's not primarily a selling problem, it's an information problem. Specifically, a gap in information about what remains stable. And no amount of enthusiasm compensates for silence on that specific point. You can have the most exciting, well-designed change in the world. And if your announcement doesn't explicitly address continuity, people's loss-averse imagination will manufacture the worst version of that gap on its own. And manufactured fears are far harder to walk back than fears you addressed proactively before they ever formed. So here's the concrete takeaway a manager can actually use this week, not a restated moral about being more positive. Before your next change announcement goes out, write down the specific, itemized list of what stays exactly the same for the people affected, and put that list first, not as a footnote after the exciting new details. Then measure your draft. If the "what changes" section outweighs the "what stays the same" section by a wide margin, you've found your framing problem before your team has to live through the consequences of it, and that's a fix you can make in an afternoon, not a 6-month culture initiative. More management theories like this follow along.